Politico writes that many legal experts, including some prominent Republicans, say the fact that a judge was nominated by a particular president is not a basis to ask him or her to avoid all cases connected to that president. We go back to Nixon and Watergate. There were 4 judges appointed by President Nixon. One, William Rehnquist, did recuse himself from consideration of anything to do with Watergate because he was actually part of the Nixon administration. But this is an interesting topic. If the guy hires you, nominates you for the job, what does the law say about your obligation to the man?
Well, first of all, the Supreme Court justices are actually relatively exempt from the recusal rules that even other federal judges are required to follow. That said, it is correct that a judge, whether it's a justice on the Supreme Court or a federal judge, should not have to recuse themselves from all cases involving the president who appointed them. That is way too broad. We are in a very unique situation here, though. We have a president who is facing not only an unprecedented number of civil and criminal liability questions, unprecedented, but also a very credible threat of impeachment. I mean, however this turns out, anyone who's being objective cannot say that there is now not a real possibility that there will be a report and a recommendation to Congress and the Senate, and that they will at least consider that question, and that questions will come out of that to the Supreme Court. That is unique. The people who have recused themselves in the past, as you said, Kagan, who was mentioned by Kelly O'Donnell, Rehnquist, they had personal connections to the circumstances in a job sense. They'd actually worked for the president in some sense. This is different. So I don't think it's a required recusal, even under the rules that would apply to federal judges. But I think recusal is as much about appearance and people's faith in the justice system as it is about what's required.
I have dozens of tweets from people who, lay people like myself, who are saying this president should not, being under investigation, even be in a position to nominate a judge at all. There are some people, legal and ethical scholars, who have chimed in on that and said, maybe that's true.
Look, I agree with that. My first choice, if I were sort of putting these in order of how we should analyze this, is he should not get to nominate someone until this investigation is done. That's the Cory Booker view, as far as I can tell. I think that even under the McConnell rule, he called Obama a, quote, lame duck president, and that's why he didn't get to nominate someone in his view. Well, I think someone who, again, is facing a credible possibility of impeachment, is under serious criminal investigation, is not, it could be also considered a lame duck president. And just, for the legitimacy of the court, and again, some of this is about the public view, and we want people to have faith in these institutions.
Right, that's huge, because right now there are a lot of Americans, polls continue to show, don't have faith in the media, they don't have faith in some of our federal institutions, they don't have faith in Congress, some don't have faith in the presidency. If people also start to lose that faith in the Supreme Court, that's worrisome for the fabric of society and democracy.
It is. Now, I will say there's one thing that distinguishes, well, there are many things, but one important thing that distinguishes the Supreme Court and all federal judges that I do place great weight on, and I don't want to ignore it, which is lifetime tenure. That is there for a reason. It is an excellent buffer to, the things that we're all concerned here with, that somebody is going to make a decision once on the court because they feel the need to return a favor or curry favor. They don't need to. I mean, practically
they're there until they choose not to be there.
And so I do have faith for the most part in federal judges and in this process, in large part because of the quality of the people and also because of lifetime tenure. But again, going back to very unique circumstances, the president and what he's facing, and a president who has shown himself to make decisions in his governance and in his policies that are about him and not about the country. For example, Brett Kavanaugh, he has opined in the past, we know, that he doesn't think that a sitting president should be indicted. So now if he is picked, that may not be the reason, but it will cause people 100% to question, is that why Trump chose him? Because people don't expect more of this president. They expect that kind of thing from him. And that's a real problem, because we need people to have faith in these institutions.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here. To watch the latest interviews and highlights, you can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.